Thank you very much for joining us again in another Tuesday essay discussion of Ayn Rand. Today's essay is The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy. So, James, could you provide us a little bit of the historical context of this, both the journalistic piece and the essay?
Well, the essay first appeared in the Objectivist magazine in January of 1969, and it refers to events, the dramatic events that had been happening behind the Iron Curtain back during the days of the Soviet Empire. So this article is more than 50 years old, but it comes at an absolutely critical moment in the history of communism and Soviet communism, in my view. To give a historical background, and I think we need a little historical background on this, in 1968, well, after 20 years of communist rule in East Germany, of course, many governments were very unpopular. It should be of no surprise after 20 years of communist rule in most of East Germany. But by a series of circumstances, which are largely fortuitous, a reformist actually took power in Czechoslovakia, a guy named Dubček, and he brought about what has been known in history as the Prague Spring. He was a reformer. It's not as though he wasn't an international socialist. He was. He wanted reformed socialism. But when he came to power, he loosened up some of the censorship and opened up some free speech, for example. And quickly there were people who became anti-Soviet in their criticism of what was going on. And that, of course, Brezhnev, who was ruling the Soviet Union at the time, found intolerable. And so basically in 1968, on the evening of August 20th, 1968, Czechoslovakia was invaded by thousands of Soviet troops supported by other Warsaw Pact troops. It basically crushed. At night, it crushed these basically innocent civilians who were attempting to create some freedom in Czechoslovakia, crushing what was known as the Prague Spring. In the Soviet Union, as a result, by the end of the year, there were a few brave protesters in Russia, mind you, protesting the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, there are people alive today who don't recall that Czechoslovakia was once one country. There wasn't a Slovakia and a Czech Republic at all. I mean, many people alive today don't even remember that they were forced together by international socialism into a single country, kind of like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia had been. Different ethnicities jammed together unnaturally. But the good people of Slovakia and the good people of Prague were fighting for their freedom, basic freedom of speech, for example, and it was utterly crushed. And this led to protests, small protests, granted, small protests even in Moscow, in Red Square, and several people in the vast openness of Red Square one day decided to mill about, and that's all they were doing. They weren't obstructing anything. Red Square, that big square in front of the Kremlin, this vast square in front of the Kremlin, of several protesters were simply there milling about, objecting, complaining about the Soviet invasion. These people were, of course, approached by mostly secret KGB agents, secret police agents of the Soviet Union, who were taking pictures and taking their names. And these people were arrested under the trumped-up charge of obstructing traffic, which, of course, they could never have really been doing. Several of these people were put on trial for simply protesting and criticizing the Soviet government. And not all of them were tried. One of the gentlemen who was arrested had so many teeth knocked out that apparently he couldn't even make a presentable, by the Soviet secret police, that he couldn't even make a presentable case in trial, mind you, where foreign observers might be. So the Soviets didn't even present him. But several of them were convicted. Three of them were sent, they reenacted the old czarist policy of exile and sent three of them away for several years, various punishments of several years, to unknown locations of secret exile. Two others were put in prison and forced labor as a result of their speaking up. And they were all risking their future careers and lives simply by being put on a KGB list, obviously. So these brave protesters. Now, there was an incredible New York Times article Ayn Rand got permission from the New York Times to reprint most of it right in the beginning of her article by Henry Kam. She praises his journalism, and interestingly enough, this same journalist, 10 years after Ayn Rand praised the journalism of Henry Kam in the New York Times, he would go on to win a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the killing fields of Cambodia. So he was actually one of the best foreign correspondents for the New York Times at the time. And just to give a little more historical perspective, many people looking back on the fall of the Soviet Union, in the early 1990s, say this was a critical moment because within the communist world, there was criticism. Within the communist world, there was sort of a crack up. And the Chinese, for example, weren't completely all on board. And so this allowed Nixon, for example, to make his infamous entree to Mao and to open up relations with China, for example. More than that, the international leftist community. Remember, we'd gone through Orwell and we'd gone through Pasternak, and now by the 60s we had Solzhenitsyn, so that a lot of people, even leftists who had been very sympathetic to the Soviet Union, were now beginning to question the Soviet Union. And with this, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, it caused leftists around the world to start being critical of the Soviet Union. Now, it's true that Thatcher and Reagan, I think, played an important role in bringing down the Soviet Union. But a lot of observers, historians, have looked back and said this was the critical moment that started the undermining of the moral, prestige that the Soviet Union had. And this was over 50 years ago now. So on many levels, Ayn Rand was absolutely prescient. She said this was the story. In the 40 years she had been out of the Soviet Union, this was the story that most got to her. And so given that historical background, Ayn Rand is talking about just a really factual, clear, but powerfully eloquent story by Henry Kam in the New York Times about these brave protesters and why they did it. And what it was, the astonishing thing about it is that, of course, the Soviet press, the press behind the Iron Curtain, wasn't going to give these guys play. They knew that precious few people within Russia were ever going to hear about their protests, if anyone, and yet they did it, and yet they went forward. And some of the statements they make are absolutely heartrending. I could not have done otherwise, said one of them. When the judge asks another one, well, do you think you were doing something right? He immediately responds, would I go to jail for something I didn't think was right? And then maybe the most eloquent of all those convicted said, and this is the one that'll bring tears to my eyes, for 3 minutes I felt free in Red Square, and for those 3 minutes I'm willing to take your 3 years. Wow. So that's the context here, the historical context here. And Ayn Rand said that of all the stories, as I say, about Russia that she'd read since she'd left the Soviet Union in the mid-1920s, this is the one that got to her most. She said very eloquently that even when she was a girl in the Soviet Union, she knew it was futile. She knew that it would be a waste of time and that no one would hear her. But she said there were moments when that would break down, where even her own emotions would break down, and she would just, I'm sorry, I don't care what the consequences are. I'd have to. So she's not saying I would have been one of these particular people, but I sure appreciate that moment. And Ayn Rand does report stories of her own college days where she did speak up, and to her own danger sometimes. So what a powerful essay. She then goes on to compare it, for example, in the late 1960s, there was a lot of university protesters and street protests in the United States, many of them violent, many of them arguing lecturers off of lecterns, radical groups claiming the right to throw Molotov cocktails, to get violent, to take over universities, that they were not their property, and so forth. And Ayn Rand makes the point, well, look, these people just want real freedom of speech. In America, led by academia, led by the media, these young protesters in America in the 1960s are claiming the right to be violent, Now, it's really interesting. She points out some of the things they want to be violent for. Violence itself, gangs of protest, marijuana laws. She left out a couple of things they were protesting too, like the Vietnam War or the draft. And one of the important things here is that Ayn Rand opposed the Vietnam War. She opposed the draft. She even opposed marijuana laws. But as she points out, it's not a question of what they were arguing. They had free speech in America. They didn't need to become violent. They were arguing for the right to be violent, not for free speech. In fact, America got out with shame out of the Vietnam War and ended the draft in America when it happened. So the contrast that she draws out here is powerful and eloquent. What we call youthful protest in America was not at all, it was a demand to be violent and to take over. Whereas the protesters in the Soviet Union were simply arguing for the right to basic free speech.
So the article is called The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy. Could you tell us a bit more on how is this word used in the report, and what does Rand think about what this is?
As good as the report was by Henry Cam, to him, the psychology of these young people who are protesting knowing that no one in their country is going to hear them, probably all alone there, and risking their lives, careers, and years in prison or exile. To him, it was an inexplicable personal alchemy, is the way he described it in the article, as if it was some kind of psychological magic that makes these young people go out and protest. Ayn Rand, of course, could identify what this was. And one of the most powerful things about this article is Ayn Rand's definition of youthful idealism, a concept that lots of people are familiar with, the idealism of youth, what makes young people idealistic. She does not define it. She never defines things by the negative, but she did not define it by the negative. Getting jaded or getting realistic or getting taught by reality, the practical circumstances so that you lose your youthful idealism. No, she doesn't define it as the negative. She defines it as the positive. It comes from the belief that ideas matter. She said it's a belief that some people hold only in their youth and lose as they get older. Some precious few retain it to the end of their lives. But it's the belief that truth matters, that facts matter, that there's something human that will respond when you point out the truth. As she points out, these protesters, just like the Czech reformers, they were probably socialists. It doesn't really matter the content of their ideas. It's the fact they had been trained. In fact, they had been trained in Soviet propaganda about Western aggression, Western imperialism, all these terrible Western things taking over the world. And from these young socialists' idealistic perspective, hey, wait a minute, we're invading Czechoslovakia. We're the aggressors. What are we doing? And so based on the ideas they were taught, so it's not a question of the content of the ideas, it's the belief that ideas matter. And that is what characterizes youthful idealism in Ayn Rand's view, a positive thing.
Could you relate this to a very common objection that objectivists encounter, which is that when you read Rand, they will say, oh, you will grow out of her. You will become less idealistic with her. Does it have any resemblance to that?
It's an assault on ideas as such, an assault on morality. See, it's really a theory-practice dichotomy, isn't it? Which, as Ayn Rand points out, is rooted in philosophy and religion, right? And this theory-practice dichotomy with supernatural ideals over here has affected secular thinkers. And so, of course, you're just being impractical. You're being an idealist. There's idealism over here and being practical over here. Ayn Rand rejected the theory-practice dichotomy at its root. And so for Ayn Rand, even a mistaken youthful idealist has got something really virtuous going on. They at least are committed to the idea of reality and truth and that it matters. And Ayn Rand realizes that, in a later article, she talked about the metaphysical versus the man-made. So what are these youthful idealists complaining about? Is it metaphysical, or is it just the man-made evils of this world? And if so, why are the youthful protesters and idealists wrong? No, they are right. If someone says, I've grown out of objectivism, that is really, to put your finger on it, is right here in this article. They've grown out of the idea that ideas matter. They've grown out of the idea that truth matters, or that ideas can make a difference and change the world for the better. That is the sad, tragic loss when someone says, oh, I grew out of Ayn Rand. They typically never even understood Ayn Rand in the first place, in my view. They were just swept up in some popular movement they never really grasped. But in some cases where they know any better, what it really consists of is just this: giving up on the idea that truth matters, that ideas are what should matter and control the world.
But don't you think that a lot of the attraction that Rand has is because both she always had this personal alchemy within her, and also because the people that read her and get the most of her have it as well?
Right. Well, of course, her ideas are closely tied to reality. Being an Aristotelian, she didn't have any of these bizarre rationalizations that most of philosophy are, much less religious ideas, which completely depart you from reality. And so for Ayn Rand, there's no theory-practice dichotomy. There's no dichotomy between the real and the ideal. If your ideas are based in reality, there is no reason to yield 1 micron on your idealism. You are right. Now, how that practically plays out is, a different matter. If you compare it, well, you'll probably get to it in a later question, so I'll let you go.
Well, my next question was going to be if you could comment on another concept that she brings up, and that is the concept of abroad, also like an idealistic issue.
Anyone who's read Ayn Rand's first novel, We the Living, which was written back in the mid-1930s, right? Only a few years after she had escaped the Soviet Union. She really gives you the sense of how people suffering under Soviet dictatorship looked at the idea of what abroad means. It's almost a vague, mystical concept of them. Atlantis and Shangri-La put together in all of their visions that somehow, somewhere, a human life is possible. And so what was the motive? What could be the motive of these young people who know that other people in Russia aren't going to hear them, basically, mostly? It's just for an international audience. It's just for the foreign press there. Reuters and the press from the Americas there, and so there's international cameras running. And that's who they were appealing to. Right? And she points out, look, if Western Europe was a glorious thing, America was the sun for people like me suffering, young people like me suffering under Soviet dictatorship. And so it really is, it's the thought that there's got to be someone out there who cares, who also knows that ideas matter, somewhere where a human life is even possible.
If I remember correctly, in one of her early I don't remember if it's one of her early theater plays, she has exactly one scene when someone brings the quote of abroad, and everyone in the stage just has complete silence and thinks, and has this kind of awe. It's very interesting that she brings it up again in this.
When Ayn Rand was a girl in Russia and a young lady in her early 20s in Russia, she would go to see films. And sometimes films would sneak through from the West, and she'd see a picture of a Cecil B. DeMille movie with a picture of an American skyline. And she would think, what kind of a paradise lives out there where the mind is free, where men are free to produce and achieve. And so to her, it became this goal to reach, so that by the time she was actually entering New York Harbor and the snow was falling, and she couldn't see the Statue of Liberty, broke her heart, but she could see the skyline and the snow was falling. Tears of splendor, she said, came down her cheeks as she realized she was reaching a place where she could finally be free to write and speak as she knew she needed to. This is just overwhelmingly a powerful essay, in my view, because it talks about the power of ideas, and the power of ideas as the best feature of youth, and how idealism is not something to be lost. It's something to be cherished, right? No, it's an enormously powerful essay. All I can say is, when you look at today, on the go back a couple years to 2020 in my country. because of belief that there was racist police violence, they took to the streets violently. They took over the Portland police station, almost set it on fire with people inside. They shot cops. They hit people with bricks. I mean, they were violent. Now, did they have all the free speech in the world? Could they have written editorials? Could they have done peaceful protests? Yes. And more than that, were the policymakers on their side? Yes. Minneapolis completely reconceived their police department after the Floyd death. New York eliminated their plainclothes division, cut $1 billion from the police budget. They changed the bail laws so that criminals could get out. And so the policymakers were all on these violent thugs' side. These violent thugs got just about everything they wanted in 2020, and still they demand the right to be violent in their protests. That's not free speech. And now contrast that, for example, with, say, an equivalent thing of the Soviet Union going on today. China, just the other day, rounded up and arrested a bunch of journalists in Hong Kong who had the nerve to criticize the Communist Party in China. Well, of course, they have to be shut down. They have to be put in jail. So consider the enormous hypocrisy going on in Western press and the Western media, particularly the American media, as people are really fighting for the right just to express their ideas peacefully. In Hong Kong, once more, just like the protesters in Moscow that Ayn Rand was talking about more than 50 years ago. What's more important? What's a real free speech issue? Talk about losing, as Ayn Rand points out, talk about losing all moral credibility that they might have had. Whatever credibility the left has when they spend 90% of their ink in newspapers defending the violent thugs for their right to throw Molotov cocktails versus the right of these peaceful protesters simply to complain about their government with verbally and peacefully. It just completely destroys the moral pretenses of anyone on the left, anyone in academia and the media who are defending these little thugs and their right to violence as opposed to the actual right of free speech.
Thank you, James. In reference to the Ayn Rand phase, Robert comments that he had an Ayn Rand phase. Yeah, me too. I had an Ayn Rand phase. Like I had a food phase and a values phase and a passion phase.
I'm still in my breathing phase. Yeah, my thinking phase. I'm sorry, I can't overcome my thinking phase. I'm going to continue to think, and so yeah. As long as that continues, I'll continue in my Ayn Rand phase. What a bizarre ad hominem psychologizing attack, as if it's only the immature. I just, in personal response to that, I would have to say that as the years have gone by, and now that I'm 58 years old, I have become more of an objectivist over the decades. Each decade that has passed has cast my Ayn Rand phase into concrete, carved it into stone even more deeply.
And talking about something related to that, these people of personal alchemy were and are in these places that are experiencing these horrible things, as you said, in Hong Kong. But where are the people of the personal alchemy in the West? What's happened to them?
I'm sorry to sigh so heavily, but it just seems that so many have completely lost any concept of what real freedom is and what real freedom of speech is. You know, in 2020, when the lockdowns were happening because of COVID in America, there were protests that went out and said, hey, these lockdowns are lasting too long, going too far, destroying the economy, hurting children, causing more death with suicides and so forth, and who knows, with international starvation. So people would go out and protest. That didn't affect anyone in 2020. The minute that the George Floyd protesters went out there and started burning and hitting cops with bricks and shooting cops in the head and taking over police stations and setting them on fire, well, those protests, now mind you, medical professional organizations came out and said, oh, no, those are okay. Those won't spread COVID. They can protest out there in large unmasked groups. Don't worry about that. But wait a minute. If you're protesting against the COVID lockdowns, well, no. And people just went along with that. The media just went along with that. There was no sense of the hypocrisy involved here at all. So you ask me, where's the inexplicable personal alchemy? It's, as Ayn Rand points out, it's always really a small minority who are going to fight this anyway, or have the courage to fight this anyway. In America, I thought, there was a greater respect for freedom and a real appreciation for the difference between free speech and violence. But apparently, no. Apparently that has declined over the 50 years since Ayn Rand had originally written. So I can only say that that is a grim fact. Of course, there's us. You know, we don't, fortunately, being in the West, being in Great Britain and the United States, we largely, well, that's disappearing too, but we largely still have free speech. So we don't have to risk our lives and our careers like these brave people in Hong Kong or these brave youthful protesters on Red Square. No, but still, it's few and far between and hard to find anymore in the free world, alas.
But why do we still have it if there's really no one willing to speak up against these kind of things, at least in a major way? Is it bureaucracy?
Yeah, well, it is the result of philosophical conditioning. It is the result of obscuring the difference between, for example, violence and words. Your words cause me, it's their microaggressions. Your words are being violent to me. On the other hand, this violence, if I hit a cop over the head with a brick, or shoot a cop in the head with a gun, or I set fire to a police station, well, that's free speech. That is the direct result of a corruption, an intentional corruption of the meaning of free speech and what freedom means and what rights are. And suddenly violence is now free speech, and free speech is now violence. No, that is a philosophical corruption that comes from academia and is supported by the media. This complete conflation, this bizarre conflation.
Let me thank Jaime for his contribution to the super chat. Thank you very much, Jaime. And Robert comments again, "You're the best, James. Don't ever stop."
Thank you, Robert.
So I'm out of questions for today. Is there anything else that you would like to comment, James?
Yeah. I want everyone to go back and read this essay. This is one of Ayn Rand's most powerful, like the Comprachicos, in my view, or like Apollo 11, which is in a positive way. Maybe Apollo 11 in a positive way, but the Comprachicos in this one in very negative ways are some of her most powerful essays. And I would urge people, even if they're not familiar with the history of Soviet communism and all the evils that occurred under it, please read this article. Please read this article. You will not be able to finish this article without, if you're a decent human being in my view, without being deeply emotionally affected by the courage of these young people that she reports about. It is powerful stuff. Powerful stuff. Like I say, just consider the line of that, the one guy. For 3 minutes in Red Square, I felt free. And for that, I'll take your 3 years. Now, if you can't be moved by the humanity there to tears, as I was, maybe you're not a human being. Now, this is, of course, Ayn Rand got some of our most powerful prose here, and I would urge people who care about such matters to read this. It will move you. It will move you.
Thank you very much, James. I think I've sometimes heard it, which is the favorite essay of many objectivists, and this is definitely one of the top. Maybe because of the personal alchemy within them.
You know, Alejandro, I have a feeling that you and I, if we lived in a totalitarian dictatorship, you and I would be out there, even if no one was hearing us.
I would. Sometimes I've made up my mind that if sometimes something happens, I run away. I'm one of the ones who went abroad. That's another story.
Well, in effect, go abroad. Find the freest place. Find the place where you can most live a human life. There's nothing wrong with that. If America became a dictatorship, there's nothing that connects me ethnically or geographically to America. I live in America because it's the place where I have the broadest freedom of speech and can do my work. If one day another country became freer, I would trade up tomorrow. Go, find the place where you can live a human life. Go, find the freest place. Go find the place where your scientific, intellectual, and artistic expression is not going to be limited by the state. That is the vital precondition for civilized existence.
Tough words, but yes, definitely.
So thank you, Alejandro. Again, I hate to be so emotional once more on one of these talks, but the subject really calls for it here. We're talking about slavery and human freedom, really, and the fundamental issue on the line there. So folks, if you find these essays at all meaningful, if you find our discussions meaningful, if you find the content that Ayn Rand Center UK puts out to be important or a worthwhile message to send to an international audience, please consider subscribing. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit share, make a comment, and please consider becoming a paying subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. The material we put out is absolutely, I'm not talking about mine either, only. I'm talking about Harry Binswanger and Don Watkins and Lisa Van Dam and our other regulars. Any one of them is worth the price of admission. So please consider becoming a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you, Carolina, who just at the last moment she made a super chat. And thank you very much again for this amazing discussion, James.
Thank you.
Great to see you emotional. It means that you care.
I think it's worth it here. Thank you.
Thank you.